The first public hearing on the processing of the corona pandemic began in Britain. Oh, Boris. The country recorded one of the highest death rates per capita in Europe. And so this first public hearing on the British government's response to the COVID-19 pandemic took place in London on Tuesday. And former Judge Heather Hallett presided over the first phase of the inquiry, which aims to determine whether Britain was adequately prepared for the pandemic, whether the response to it was appropriate, and what lessons can be learned for the future. This hearing this week began with videotape reports from relatives of those who died from the coronavirus, who had little opportunity to say goodbye due to the strict corona and contact restrictions. And people had gathered in front of the building for a vigil, and some of them criticized that members of their group did not get enough say in the investigation. The particular focus of the investigation is likely to be the decisions made by then Prime Minister Boris Johnson and his cabinet. Johnson was repeatedly criticized for his hesitant attitude. The first lockdown in Great Britain only began on March 23rd in 2020, and the government was also criticized in the context of contact tracing and the availability of corona tests during the first months of the pandemic. Thousands of government documents and WhatsApp messages should now help the investigative committee to get an idea. In May 2021, Johnson announced the independent investigation into the government's own handling of the pandemic. I hope this won't fire back. The public hearings as part of the COVID-19 inquiry are scheduled to be completed in 2026. About 227,000 people died from COVID-19 in the UK according to death certificates, and despite the smaller population, this is significantly more than in Germany. The per capita death rate associated with COVID-19 infection in the UK is among the highest in Europe overall. And from today's perspective, the appearance on television of March 23rd in 2020 by then Prime Minister Boris Johnson sounds almost a bit surreal. I have to give the people of Great Britain a very simple instruction. You have to stay at home, was the announcement. The British government had hesitated for a long time and relied on herd immunity, but then it imposed a rigorous lockdown. Within hours, public life in the UK came to a standstill, and schools, shops, sports facilities and pubs have been closed. Relatives want answers from the Commission of Inquiry as to why so many people had to die in Great Britain during the pandemic. Almost all people in Great Britain are affected by this drama in some way, and many have lost loved ones in dramatic circumstances, and the country continues to face endemic grief to this day. It has never been processed to this day. And now the processing is running. A committee of inquiry led by, as I said, former Judge Baroness Hallett, will question hundreds of witnesses and review thousands of documents over the coming months and years. The investigation cannot undo what happened, but in the end, it wants to be able to answer three questions for the millions of people affected. Was Britain sufficiently prepared for a pandemic? Were the government's measures correct and appropriate? And in particular, what can they learn from the events for the future? And as I said, the then Prime Minister Boris Johnson initiated the corona investigation himself. But don't expect quick answers. As I said earlier in the video, the investigation ends in the summer of 2026. But before opening the case, Committee Chair Hallett insisted on receiving unedited WhatsApp messages and notes written by Johnson, who was, as everybody knows, in office during the height of the coronavirus pandemic. And Johnson's successor, Rishi Sunak, who was Finance Minister or Chancellor of the Exchequer at the time, challenged the requirement. But Sunak denied wanting to block the material. And Johnson himself is reportedly in favor of releasing the footage. But a court is expected to decide the matter at the end of June. Survivors of COVID-19 victims should not be allowed to testify in the first 6 weeks of the investigation. And those really sharply criticized this decision. This is a farce, was said by some, who, for example, a doctor who lost her father during the pandemic, and members of the COVID-19 bereaved organization Bereaved Families for Justice lined up at a protest outside the inquiry's headquarters in central London and held up the pictures of their loved ones. A spokesman for the inquiry said Chairwoman Hallett did not rule out soliciting testimony from survivors at later stages of the inquiry. Well, public inquiries in the UK are funded by the government but are independently chaired, and they investigate matters of public interest and are charged with finding facts, determining the reasons for what happened, and learning lessons. However, the investigative committees are not allowed to negotiate the civil or criminal liability of those involved, and their recommendations are also not legally binding. But the interesting part here is that, I have to repeat it, the Prime Minister of the time was Boris Johnson. And this chapter is not over for him either. But with his resignation as an MP, his political career is over for the time being. But the former Prime Minister is known to keep coming back. And it cannot be ruled out that Johnson could again use a tactic that brought him to power before. Boris Johnson's resignation has undoubtedly caused a great deal of media frenzy. And at the same time, it also became clear how little support there is for him in the meantime. Sunak managed to calm the situation down a bit, but Johnson is undoubtedly another human hand grenade, so not only Truss. But that doesn't mean he blew up the Conservative Party. Nevertheless, it's possible that Johnson will run for a seat considered safe for the Tories at the 24 election, and his hope will be that Rishi Sunak will resign after losing this election. Because then the Conservative Party could be looking for a politician who has already proven that he can win elections, and in his case he means someone like him. In a way, Johnson sees himself as the reincarnation of former Prime Minister Winston Churchill, and in the 1930s Churchill spent some time in the political wilderness before he was called back into politics in the hour of need. And like Churchill, Johnson always wants to be at the center of things, the center of attention, and he believes he has something of a messianic power to persuade voters to vote Conservative. And if you want to understand the Conservative Party today, you have to know the situation at the time of the Brexit referendum and before. The right-wing populist Brexit Party had terrified the Tories, and to counter it, the Conservatives have appropriated their rhetoric and to some extent their policies, morphing into what at least resembles a populist far-right party. And the party is in a descent that can no longer be stopped. The best they can do is avoid a hard crash by making a kind of forced landing, losing, but maybe still being competitive. And Tories' fears of losing right-flank support within the party remains, though. But for now, it may be mitigated by the fact that Nigel Farage is no longer in politics. But if he comes back and the Conservatives lose the 2024 election, the party could panic once again. And with that, a comeback by Boris Johnson is not completely ruled out. But we will see what happens, but I still have to talk about these topics. And it was a video with a very serious topic in the beginning, which had to deal with Boris Johnson, and that's why I combined the two. He, and I say it for the 5th and 10th time in this video, he was the Prime Minister at the time. And if you want to know more about British politics, the next video is right here in the end screen. I'll see you there. I'll be back.